What's going on, everyone? This is Kevin here, coming at you with my LG Stylo 6 pros and cons. So we're going to discuss the best and worst things about the phone. So let's get started. So these are my LG Stylo 6 pros and cons. Let's start with the pros. So the first pro with this phone is the large display. I really like that we're getting a massive 6.8-inch display with the phone. In fact, make sure after this video to watch my LG Stylo 6 versus LG Stylo 5 video, and you'll see in that video how much larger the 6 is compared to the 5. So in addition to that, we are getting a 1080p display with a PPI of 395. We're getting a 20.5 by 9 aspect ratio. So an extremely narrow but tall form factor here with the phone. So all those things are very impressive. I'm personally a big fan of these large displays. I know that not everybody is, but I like them because you can fit a lot of your social media feed in just one frame. Moving on to number 2, and that is 64 gigabytes of internal storage. I'm a huge fan of LG's decision to give the Stylo 6 twice the amount of internal storage that they gave the Stylo 5. Now, I understand that both devices do feature microSD card expansion, so technically you could add a lot more storage by inserting a microSD card, but nothing's better than old-fashioned internal storage, so I'm definitely happy that we're getting 64 gigs with this phone. In fact, I've only had this phone for several days now, and it's not even that far away from filling up to 32 gigs between my content and the software that's pre-installed on here. So that's pretty remarkable. And it definitely makes sense why the LG Stylo 6 has 64 gigabytes instead of 32. If they had given it 32, then the phone would fill up so quickly, and it's just not realistic anymore in 2020. So good job, LG, for giving this phone 64 gigs. My third favorite thing about the LG Stylo 6 is that we're getting a very large battery at 4,000 milliamp hours. This is an upgrade from the LG Stylo 5, which had 3,500 milliamp hours. So I understand that's not the biggest difference, but still, I really appreciate it. So with such a large battery life should not be a concern of yours. Moving on to my fourth favorite thing about the LG Stylo 6, and that's that we get an ultra wide angle camera with the phone. Now, let me clarify that the ultra wide camera on here doesn't necessarily produce the best photos in the world, that's for sure, especially compared to a flagship phone. But still, I'm glad that we have the feature because there are certain situations where it does come in handy to have an ultra wide angle camera, and it does kind of mix things up a little bit from the typical 13 megapixel camera on the phone. So that now you can take a variety of different photos, with some being in the regular form factor and others being in the ultra wide form factor. This is something that I was really hoping LG would add to the Stylo line, so I certainly commend them for it. Moving on to my fifth favorite thing about the LG Stylo 6, and that's that we have a pop-in, pop-out stylus with the phone. So this is very similar to how the stylus works with the various Galaxy Note phones, but with the LG Stylo 5, you didn't have this. Instead, you had to pick the stylus out of the phone, and that got the job done, but this is definitely a lot more fancy. So I'm really happy that LG did do this, and overall, it's just a great implementation, and it does make this phone feel a lot more like a higher-end Note phone. And for my final pro with the phone, and there are way more things I could continue to go on about beyond this, but these are my top favorites, but that is that we get NFC with the LG Stylo 6. Now, I know that that doesn't sound very impressive, and the Stylo 5 had NFC as well, so that's great, but not too many phones nowadays in 2020, at least when it comes to budget devices, give you NFC. For example, the Moto G Stylus, which is probably the biggest competitor to the LG Stylo 6, does not give you NFC, but we do get it here with the Stylo 6. So that is definitely music to my ears. Now overall, I'm a big fan of this phone, but let me go over the various cons about it. So number one is that the display does not get very bright. So I know right now, looking at the device, it doesn't seem too dim, but I have the brightness set at 100%. And definitely check out my comparison between the Stylo 6 and Stylo 5, and you'll see that this display cannot get nearly as bright as the 5. And that's very strange because LG has a long history of making TVs and monitors and other displays. So you'd think that not only would they have a ton of experience with it, but they'd be able to pack in a really high quality one into a budget phone, because since they make so many of them as it is, they can build them for very cheap. But apparently they went even cheaper and downgraded the brightness ability of the display with the LG Stylo 6. So is it a deal breaker? I don't necessarily think so. But if you are switching from a Stylo 5 to a Stylo 6, then you are definitely going to notice that the display here does not get as bright. The second con with the LG Stylo 6 is that we don't get face unlock with the phone. This is another thing that the LG Stylo 5 had that they've removed with the LG Stylo 6. Now, in LG's defense, they're not the only company that has been removing face unlock. Motorola is another example, whereas the Moto G Power and also the Moto G Stylus both also don't have face unlock, but last year's Moto G7, G7 Power, all those phones did. So it seems like all the companies are moving away from that, and thankfully we do still have the fingerprint sensor on the back that does work very well. But if you are someone that does like face unlock, then you are going to be a little bit disappointed with the Stylo 6. Now, another thing I want to mention too is that the face unlock that the Stylo 5 had really wasn't the most secure implementation of face unlock, but for the majority of people out there, it got the job done and it was certainly better than nothing. The third con with the LG Stylo 6 is the front design of the phone. So the first thing is that we're getting a notch with the device. Now, this is another thing that I don't really consider to be a deal breaker, but this is more of a 2019 design trend. Whereas now in 2020, most phones feature either a pop-up camera or they have a hole punch in the display for the front-facing camera. But LG did decide to give this phone a water drop notch instead. It seems like this is something that LG is still doing with all of their devices. I have no clue why. But for example, the upcoming LG Velvet, which is their upper mid-tier phone, also features a water drop instead of a hole punch or a pop-up camera. So this does seem to be something that LG is continuing to do company-wide, and I have no clue why. We also have a little bit of a thicker bottom bezel on the device, and in addition to that, all the various bezels on the phone are a little bit thicker than I feel like they need to be, especially compared to other devices like the Samsung Galaxy A51, which feature way smaller bezels and a hole punch for the front-facing camera. The fourth con with the LG Stylo 6 is that the phone features a low amount of RAM and a pretty mediocre processor. So this phone has 3 gigabytes of RAM, which is the same amount of RAM that its predecessor had, and even the Stylo 4 had a specific variant that did also have 3 gigs. So LG doesn't really seem to want to give this phone more RAM, and I really don't know why. Now, I do think that there is a limit to the amount of RAM that you can really give a phone nowadays and get a proportional benefit, but I think if the LG Stylo 6 had 4 gigs of RAM instead of 3, that would have made a big difference. The second thing is that with the phone, we're getting the MediaTek Helio P35. Now, it is an upgrade over the processor that the Stylo 5 had, so that's great. But the Helio P35 still isn't that powerful. I did a benchmark test with the phone, and I'll show you the score right now, but I got an overall score of, and let it load here for a second, I got a score of 105,537. And you'll see in my Stylo 5 versus 6 comparison that the 5 scores in the 80,000 range. So certainly this is an upgrade, but it's certainly not a significant upgrade, that's for sure. I wish LG had given this phone a Helio P60 or maybe a Snapdragon 665, but unfortunately we do just have the Helio P35. I do want to clarify though, that I know that MediaTek doesn't have the best reputation out there, but they've come a long way in the last couple of years. So the MediaTek Helio line of processors are actually quite good. I don't have any problems with them. And again, the P35 is not an awful processor. I'm not saying it's awful. It's just not like a huge improvement over what we had last year. So I feel like at the price tag that this phone is being offered at, we could have gotten a processor that was a little bit better. And finally, for the last con with the LG Stylo 6, that is that we don't get 4K video recording. Now, I'm personally not that into 4K video recording, but a lot of other phones that this device will be compared to and that it competes against do offer that. For example, the Galaxy A51, which is slightly higher end than the Stylo 6, but still kind of in the same budget ballpark, does give us 4K video recording. And also the Moto G Stylus gives us 4K video recording. And in addition to that, to make things even worse, and you'll see it in my full review of this phone, the video quality, despite being 1080p, doesn't look extremely great. It's decently smooth, so I'll give LG credit for that, but the bitrate seems very low. So it's almost like a hybrid between 720p and 1080p with the video quality from this device, so they're certainly lacking quite a bit in that department. In case you're curious, I'm actually using the Samsung Galaxy A51 to record this video. I've been using it to record many of my videos on the channel lately. There's the phone right there. And I already know that there is no way I could get away with recording a video here for the channel with the LG Stylo 6. It just wouldn't work. The quality just wouldn't be good enough. I might give it a try though and sneak it in with one of my future videos, but I know that the quality will be lower. But I hope you enjoyed this pros and cons video about the LG Stylo 6. I'm definitely curious to know your thoughts about this phone and whether or not you think it's worth buying. In many ways, it is an upgrade over the Stylo 5, but in some ways, it's not. But I hope you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and I will see you in the next one.